A powerful CEO dismisses an employee after discovering she's pregnant with his child, destroying her career to protect his reputation. Decades later, her son unknowingly begins working for the same man, and a single conversation shatters the fragile facade of their lives. Naomi Hayes sat across from Victor Campbell's imposing desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The plush leather chair beneath her felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who fit into the gleaming world of Campbell Enterprises. Victor, his sharp features illuminated by the light streaming through the office's expansive windows, didn't look up from the stack of papers on his desk. The soft scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room, each stroke adding to the weight pressing on Naomi's chest. Finally, with an exhale that seemed rehearsed, Victor set his pen down and leaned back in his chair. His gaze, cool and calculating, fell on Naomi, pinning her in place. "Naomi," he said, his voice calm but distant. "I assume this isn't about work." Naomi's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment over and over, but the words now felt trapped, lodged in her throat. Swallowing hard, she forced herself to speak. "It's not," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. I'm pregnant." For a moment, Victor didn't react. The room seemed to grow colder as the seconds stretched into an uncomfortable silence. Finally, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his fingers steepled. "I see." Naomi swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she added, "It's yours, Victor. I thought you should know." Victor's expression didn't change. If he was shocked, he didn't show it. Instead, he let out a small sigh, his tone remaining calm but distant. "This is unfortunate." The word stung. "Unfortunate?" Naomi repeated, disbelief lacing her voice. She had expected shock, perhaps even anger, but this cold indifference. It was worse than she could have imagined. "Yes," Victor said, leaning back in his chair. "You should have been more careful." Naomi's stomach twisted, the weight of his words hitting her like a punch. "We were careful," she protested, her voice cracking. Victor shook his head, his gaze piercing. "Clearly, not careful enough." He sighed again, rubbing his temples briefly before meeting her eyes. "So, what do you expect me to do about this?" Naomi blinked, struggling to maintain her composure. I thought you'd want to know. That maybe we could figure something out together." Victor's face hardened. "Naomi, I'm married. I have a family, a reputation to uphold. This," he gestured dismissively between them, "was never supposed to be more than what it was." The words sliced through her like a knife. Late nights working in his office, stolen moments that felt like more than just an affair. They had all meant something to her. But to Victor, they were disposable. "I'm keeping the baby," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. Victor stood, walking around his desk to stand in front of her. His towering presence was intimidating, but Naomi refused to shrink under his gaze. "I can't be involved in this," he said firmly. "You know that. This conversation, it never happened. Understand?" Naomi's blood ran cold. "You're just walking away. You're the father, Victor." "I have to," Victor said, his tone unyielding. "You should too." Anger flared in Naomi's chest, replacing the initial shock. She stood, meeting his eyes with defiance. "I can't just walk away from this. This is your child too." Victor's jaw tightened, his expression darkening. "Naomi, I'm warning you. Let this go. I've looked out for you up until now, but if you make this a problem for me, you'll regret it." "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. Victor turned away, walking back to his desk and sitting down with the same calculated calm he had shown throughout the conversation. "This is your last day at Campbell Enterprises," he said coldly. "HR has already been informed. You'll receive a severance package, but after today you're no longer an employee here." Naomi froze, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "You're firing me? Because I'm pregnant? Because of you?" Victor's eyes met hers, icy and detached. "I'm protecting my family, Naomi. And you should focus on protecting yourself." Her hands shook as anger and despair battled within her. "I never thought you'd do this," she said quietly, her voice heavy with disappointment. "You never should have thought anything else," Victor replied, his tone devoid of emotion. Blinking back tears, Naomi turned and walked out of the office. Her legs felt like they were moving on autopilot as she returned to her desk. Mechanically, she packed her belongings, each item slipping into her bag, feeling heavier than the last. The elevator ride down to the lobby was a blur. When she stepped onto the street, the tears finally came, spilling down her cheeks as she clutched her bag tightly. She felt invisible, just another face in the crowd. No one would know the truth of what had happened, not the man who had ruined her life, nor the people who worked under him. Naomi placed a trembling hand on her stomach, a bittersweet surge of determination rising within her. She might have lost her job, her stability, and the life she had worked so hard to build, but she still had her child. And for that, she would find a way to survive. She would not let Victor Campbell's betrayal define her future. The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the small apartment, casting a warm glow on the cozy living room. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and the faint hum of a morning radio gave the space an air of comfort. Naomi Hayes, seated at the kitchen table with a steaming mug in her hands, gazed absently at the swirling patterns on its surface. Her face was calm, but her knuckles were white as they gripped the mug, betraying the storm of thoughts racing in her mind. In the adjacent bedroom, Daniel Hayes stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the tie on his new suit for the third time. The reflection staring back at him was one of determination and hope. Today was the day he had been working toward for years, his first day at Campbell Enterprises, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. "Looking sharp," Daniel said to himself with a confident grin as he straightened his posture. He ran a hand over his neatly cropped hair, nodding in approval. The soft whistle of the kettle boiling in the kitchen broke the silence. Daniel checked the time on his phone, 5 minutes to spare. It was enough to grab a blessing from his mom before heading out. He slipped into his polished shoes, grabbed his briefcase, and walked into the kitchen. "Morning, Mom," Daniel announced, spinning on his heel to show off his suit. "What do you think? First day material or what?" Naomi looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. "You look great, sweetheart. Very professional." Her voice was warm, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "First day at Campbell Enterprises, Mom. Can you believe it?" Daniel sat down across from her, his excitement barely contained. "This is huge. All the late nights, the internships, it's finally paying off." Naomi nodded, her fingers tightening around the mug. "It's a big day," she said softly, her gaze falling back to the rising steam. "But—" Daniel's brows knitted. "But what?" Naomi hesitated, her words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him, to warn him about the shadows that loomed over that company, but the words refused to come. Instead, she shook her head slightly. "It's nothing. I just want you to be careful." "Careful?" Daniel repeated, leaning forward. "Mom, it's Campbell Enterprises, one of the top firms in the country. This is going to change everything for us." "I know, baby," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes, things aren't always what they seem." Daniel frowned, confusion flickering across his face. His mother, the one who had always been his biggest cheerleader, seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. "Do you know someone who worked there?" he asked, trying to piece together her cryptic words. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. Her gaze remained fixed on the mug in her hands, and her silence spoke louder than words. After a moment, she shook her head. "It's nothing like that," she said finally. "I just want you to keep your eyes open. Promise me that." Daniel sat back, the excitement in his chest dimming slightly. "Mom, I've worked hard for this. We've worked hard for this. I'm not walking into a trap. I'm walking into my future." "I know," Naomi said, finally meeting his eyes. There was a shadow of something in her expression, fear, maybe, or regret. I just don't want you to get hurt. Daniel reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. Mom, I'll be fine. This is going to be good for us. You'll see. Naomi's smile was small but weary, like it cost her something to force it. I trust you, Daniel. I always have. Good, Daniel said, standing and checking his watch. Now wish me luck because I've got a train to catch. Naomi stood with him, following him to the door. As he grabbed his briefcase and opened it, she touched his arm gently. Good luck, sweetheart. Daniel grinned, leaning down to kiss her cheek. Thanks, Mom. I'll make you proud. As he stepped out the door, Daniel felt a surge of excitement again. This was it, his chance to prove himself, to create a life of success and stability for both of them. The shadow of doubt that had crept in during his conversation with his mother faded into the background. Naomi watched him go, the door closing softly behind him. She stood there for a long moment, her heart heavy with worry. Her baby, her only son, was walking into a place she had tried to forget for decades, a place filled with ghosts she had spent years burying. She had wanted to tell him the truth, but how could she? How could she risk breaking his spirit on a day meant to celebrate his hard work and ambition? Back at the table, Naomi sat down and wrapped her hands around the cooling mug of coffee. She stared at the small apartment they shared, filled with the evidence of their struggles and triumphs. A photo of Daniel's graduation sat proudly on the shelf, a reminder of how far they had come. He had worked so hard, and she couldn't let her fears tarnish his moment. Yet deep down, she couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. The past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. She could only hope that Daniel's light would shine too brightly for the shadows to reach him. And with that hope, Naomi whispered a quiet prayer. That her son would find the success he deserved without the ghosts of her past catching up to him. The towering glass facade of Campbell Enterprises gleamed under the morning sun, its reflective surface shimmering like a beacon of success. Daniel Hayes stood on the sidewalk, craning his neck to take in the building's sheer height. This was it, the place he had worked so hard to reach. Adjusting his tie and gripping his briefcase tightly, he stepped through the revolving doors, his heart racing with excitement and anticipation. Inside, the lobby was a study in modern elegance. Marble floors stretched across the vast space, reflecting the sleek lines of the chrome fixtures and the soft glow of pendant lights. A buzz of activity filled the air as professionals moved purposefully, their voices a low hum against the backdrop of clicking heels and ringing phones. Daniel took a deep breath, willing himself to exude the same confidence as everyone around him. He approached the front desk, where a polished receptionist greeted him with a warm but efficient smile. Good morning, Mr. Hayes. Welcome to Campbell Enterprises. You'll be meeting with Ms. Robinson, your supervisor. She'll be here shortly. Thank you, Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. A moment later, Cassandra Robinson, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper pace, appeared. Daniel Hayes? She asked briskly, her gaze appraising. Yes, ma'am, Daniel said, standing a little taller. Follow me, she said, motioning for him to keep up as she strode toward the elevators. The ride up to the 35th floor was quick and silent, the only sound the faint hum of the elevator. As the doors opened, Daniel was greeted by the sight of an expansive, open-concept office. Glass-walled conference rooms lined the perimeter, and rows of desks stretched across the space, each occupied by someone deeply immersed in their work. The atmosphere was electric, buzzing with the energy of a company at the top of its game. This is where you'll be working, Cassandra said, leading him to a desk near a large window. The view's a perk, but don't let it distract you. We expect excellence here, Mr. Hayes. Yes, ma'am, Daniel said, smiling. I'm ready to get started. She gave him a curt nod. Good. Dive into these reports first. I'll check in later. As Daniel settled into his desk, he allowed himself a moment to take it all in. The view of the city skyline was breathtaking, and the high-tech setup of his workstation spoke volumes about the company's commitment to success. He felt a surge of pride. This was where he belonged. Hours passed as Daniel immersed himself in the reports Cassandra had given him. He was beginning to find his rhythm, when a shadow passed over his desk. Glancing up, he saw a group of senior executives walking down the hallway, deep in conversation. At the center of the group was Victor Campbell, the CEO himself. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks and introductions. By late afternoon, Daniel was beginning to feel more comfortable, even starting to envision his future here. That's when Cassandra appeared again, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone as brisk as ever. "Mr. Campbell would like to see you in his office." Daniel blinked. "Mr. Campbell? The CEO?" "Yes," she said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "He's on the 40th floor. Don't keep him waiting." Daniel stood, his heart pounding. Why would Victor Campbell want to see him? New hires didn't get summoned by the CEO, especially not on their first day. Straightening his tie, he made his way to the elevator, his palms damp as he pressed the button for the top floor. Victor's office was nothing short of spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view of the city, and the room's minimalist design exuded power and precision. Victor sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his back to the window as he reviewed a stack of papers. He didn't look up immediately when Daniel entered. Daniel's breath caught. Victor's presence was commanding. His tailored suit and air of authority made him stand out even among the high-powered executives surrounding him. As the group passed, Victor's gaze flicked to Daniel. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. In that brief exchange, something passed between them. Victor's expression remained neutral and professional, but his eyes lingered just a second too long, narrowing slightly as though trying to place a memory. Daniel felt a strange jolt, a sense of recognition he couldn't explain. Just as quickly, Victor turned back to his conversation, continuing down the hall without a second glance. Daniel shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up his spine. It was just his imagination. Victor Campbell didn't know him. Why would he? He was just another employee, one of hundreds in the company. "Come in, Mr. Hayes," Victor said, his voice calm but commanding. "Have a seat." Daniel crossed the room and sat in the leather chair opposite the desk, his nerves jangling. Victor finally looked up, his sharp gaze locking onto Daniel's. "So," Victor began, setting the papers aside. "How's your first day going?" "Good, sir," Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's been busy, but I'm enjoying it." Victor nodded, leaning back in his chair. "That's what I like to hear. We have high expectations here, Mr. Hayes. I trust you'll meet them." "I'll do my best, sir," Daniel said, his confidence returning slightly. Victor studied him for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Your last name caught my attention. Hayes, is it?" Daniel nodded, his stomach tightening. "Yes, sir. Daniel Hayes." Victor's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. A shadow of recognition, perhaps. He leaned forward slightly. "It's a strong name," he said, his tone measured. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine but forced himself to smile. "Thank you, sir." Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. "I like to keep an eye on new talent. We expect great things from you, Mr. Hayes. Keep up the good work." "Thank you, sir," Daniel said, standing as Victor gestured toward the door. As he left the office, Daniel's mind raced. The interaction had been polite, even encouraging, but there was something about the way Victor had looked at him, something that didn't sit right. He couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Campbell's interest in him wasn't purely professional. The elevator ride back to the 35th floor felt longer than it should have. Daniel tried to brush off the unease, reminding himself that this was just the beginning of his career. He couldn't afford to overthink things now. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the last time he'd find himself in Victor Campbell's office. The familiar warmth of their small apartment greeted Daniel Hayes as he pushed the door open. The scent of lavender cleaner lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed tea. He set his briefcase down gently by the door, loosening his tie as he stepped into the living room. Naomi Hayes was sitting on the couch, a book open in her lap, though her eyes weren't on the page. She looked up when Daniel entered, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "You're home," she said softly, closing the book and setting it aside. Daniel flopped onto the couch beside her, letting out a long sigh. "First day done," he said, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "It was a lot. The place is incredible, Mom. You should have seen it." Naomi smiled faintly, but there was tension in her posture that Daniel couldn't ignore. She didn't ask him about his day, didn't light up the way she usually did when he came home with news. Instead, she looked at him with an almost hesitant gaze. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, sitting up straighter. "You've been weird about this job since I got it. Is there something you're not telling me?" Naomi's hands twisted together in her lap. She took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Daniel, there's something I should have told you a long time ago. Something about your father." Daniel frowned, his stomach tightening. He had asked about his father many times growing up, but the answer had always been vague. "He left. He's not in our lives." "What about him?" he asked cautiously. Naomi hesitated again, her eyes dropping to her hands. "Your father. He's not who you think. He didn't just leave us. He's—" She paused, her voice trembling. "He's Victor Campbell." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, Daniel's breath catching in his chest. "What?" he whispered, the word barely audible. Naomi met his eyes, her own filled with guilt and pain. "Victor Campbell is your father. I met him when I was working at Campbell Enterprises. We were involved. When I told him I was pregnant, he fired me. He blacklisted me from the industry." Daniel stared at her, his mind reeling. "You're saying, my boss, Victor Campbell, the guy I met today, is my father?" Naomi nodded, her expression filled with regret. "I should have told you sooner. I thought I was protecting you by keeping it from you." Daniel stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "You thought you were protecting me? Mom, I've spent my whole life wondering who he was. And now, on the first day of my dream job, I find out he's been right there the whole time." "I didn't know you'd end up there," Naomi said, her voice breaking. "When you told me, I wanted to tell you, but I didn't want to ruin this opportunity for you." Daniel paced the room, his thoughts racing. "He fired you, blacklisted you. Why didn't you fight back?" Naomi's shoulders slumped, tears welling in her eyes. "I tried, Daniel. But he was powerful, and I was alone. I had you to think about. I couldn't risk losing everything." Daniel stopped pacing, his fists clenched at his sides. "And he just walked away? Pretended like we didn't exist?" "Yes," Naomi said, her voice heavy with the weight of years of pain. "He chose his career, his family, his reputation over us. He left me to pick up the pieces." Daniel's chest heaved as anger and disbelief battled within him. The man he had admired just hours ago, the man whose name was synonymous with success, was the same man who had abandoned him and destroyed his mother's life. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice rising. "I've spent my whole life not knowing him, and now I have to work for him." "I was trying to protect you," Naomi repeated, standing to face him. "I didn't want you to carry the burden of his choices. I wanted you to have your own life, free from his shadow." Daniel shook his head, his voice breaking. "But it's not free, is it? He's been there all along, and now I'm tied to him whether I like it or not." Tears streamed down Naomi's face as she reached for him. "Daniel, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want you to get hurt." Daniel stepped back, his heart pounding. "I need to think," he said, grabbing his coat. "I need to get out of here." "Daniel, wait!" Naomi called after him, but he was already out the door. The cool evening air hit Daniel's face as he stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside him. He walked aimlessly, his mind replaying the conversation over and over. His father was Victor Campbell. The man who had abandoned him and his mother was now his boss, sitting in a pristine office high above the city, while they had struggled for years to get by. Daniel clenched his fists, anger boiling to the surface. How could someone be so cruel? so detached from the consequences of their actions. And how could his mother have kept this from him for so long? As the city lights blurred past him, Daniel's steps slowed. He couldn't change the past, but the weight of the truth was suffocating. What would he do now? Confront Victor? Quit the job he had worked so hard to get? He didn't know. All he knew was that everything he thought he knew about his life had just been shattered. The only certainty was that nothing would ever be the same again. The upscale restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations and the soft clinking of silverware against fine china. The dim lighting casts a warm glow over the elegantly set tables, creating an air of exclusivity and refinement. Seated near the large corner window was Victor Campbell, his wife Evelyn, and their son Simon, all dressed impeccably. Victor exuded his usual air of authority, gesturing animatedly as he recounted a story from work. Evelyn laughed politely, her diamond earrings catching the light, while Simon, a young man in his early 20s, rolled his eyes with mild amusement. To the outside world, they looked like the picture of a perfect family, successful, polished, untouchable. But that image was about to be shattered. Daniel Hayes stood outside the restaurant, his breath visible in the cool night air. His heart hammered in his chest, his fists clenched at his sides. Through the window he could see them, Victor laughing, Evelyn smiling, Simon leaning back casually in his chair. They looked so normal. How could they sit there, enjoying a luxurious dinner, while he and his mother had struggled for years? The anger that had been simmering inside Daniel since his mother's revelation now boiled over. He pushed open the heavy glass door, his steps purposeful as he crossed the threshold. The maitre d' looked up, startled, but before he could speak, Daniel scanned the room and made a beeline for Victor's table. Victor was mid-sentence when he noticed Daniel approaching. His voice faltered, and for a brief moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped. His sharp blue eyes met Daniel's, and the recognition was immediate. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Can I help you?" Victor said, his tone controlled but edged with tension. Daniel stopped at the edge of the table, his presence casting a shadow over the family. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of years of pain and anger. "You already know why I'm here, Victor." Evelyn glanced between them, her brow furrowing. "Victor, who is this?" Victor hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Just someone from the office." "Not just someone," Daniel said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm Daniel Hayes, Naomi Hayes' son." The name hit Victor like a slap. His posture stiffened and his expression darkened, but he said nothing. Evelyn's confusion deepened. "Victor, who is he talking about? What's going on?" Simon, leaning forward now, studied Daniel with a curious, almost skeptical expression. "Yeah, Dad. Care to explain?" Daniel's gaze never left Victor's. "Why don't you tell them, Victor? Tell them how you fired my mother when she told you she was pregnant. Tell them how you blacklisted her from the industry, how you left us with nothing." Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What?" Simon's jaw dropped, his expression shifting to one of disbelief. "You're kidding, right? Dad, this guy's joking, right?" Victor stood abruptly, his towering presence meant to intimidate. But for once, Daniel wasn't intimidated. "This isn't the place," Victor said sharply, his voice low. "No," Daniel shot back. "This is exactly the place. Your wife deserves to know the truth. Your son deserves to know who you really are." "Victor," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "Is this true?" Victor's face was pale now, the confident facade cracking. "Evelyn, He abandoned us," Daniel interrupted, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "My mother told him she was pregnant and he fired her, blacklisted her, left us to struggle while he sat here building his empire, pretending we didn't exist." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she turned to her husband. "You have another child? And you did this to him? To his mother?" Simon stood now, his hands braced on the table. "Dad, what the hell is this? You're seriously telling me you have another son?" Victor's composure finally crumbled. "I made mistakes," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't know what else to do. Mistakes? Daniel spat, his anger boiling over. You call destroying my mother's career and abandoning your child a mistake? You didn't care what happened to us as long as your precious reputation stayed intact. Evelyn's tears spilled over. Victor, how could you? We've been married for over 20 years. I trusted you. I built my life with you. How could you lie to me like this? Victor reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Evelyn, I thought it was over. I thought I could protect you from this. Protect me, she repeated, her voice shaking. You didn't protect anyone but yourself. Simon's voice cut through the tension, filled with anger and disgust. So you're telling me I've got a brother you never mentioned? A brother you abandoned? Daniel's chest heaved as he looked at Victor, the man who had caused so much pain. You can't hide anymore, Victor. The truth is out. Your perfect little world is crumbling, and you have no one to blame but yourself. Victor slumped back into his chair, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the confrontation. For the first time, he looked small, no longer the powerful CEO, but a man brought low by his own actions. I'm sorry, Victor whispered, but the words were hollow, devoid of meaning. Daniel shook his head. Sorry doesn't fix what you did. Sorry doesn't erase the years of struggle, the nights my mother cried herself to sleep. Sorry doesn't make you a father. Evelyn stood, her face a mixture of betrayal and heartbreak. I can't do this, she said, grabbing her purse. Come on, Simon. Let's go. Simon hesitated, glaring at his father before following his mother out of the restaurant. Victor didn't stop them. He didn't move at all. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring down at the man who had once seemed untouchable. You don't get to walk away from this, he said quietly. Not anymore. With that, Daniel turned and walked out, leaving Victor alone at the table, surrounded by the wreckage of his carefully constructed life. The hum of the restaurant continued around him, but for Victor Campbell, the world had come crashing down. The usually immaculate halls of Campbell Enterprises were buzzed with a restless energy that hadn't been there before. Employees whispered in clusters, their conversations hurried and filled with speculation. Eyes darted toward the glass-walled office that had once belonged to Victor Campbell, now conspicuously dark and unoccupied. The news had broken early that morning. Victor Campbell had officially stepped down as CEO. The company's board of directors released a carefully worded statement, citing his desire to focus on personal matters as the reason for his resignation. But everyone knew the truth. The scandal had spread like wildfire, starting with whispers from the restaurant confrontation and culminating in a media frenzy. Victor's name, once synonymous with success and integrity, now carried the weight of betrayal and disgrace. Daniel Hayes sat at his desk on the 35th floor, staring blankly at his computer screen. Around him, the hum of the office continued, but it all felt distant and muted. His phone buzzed for the 100th time that day, another text from a colleague, no doubt fishing for details. He ignored it, letting the device vibrate silently against the desk. The email announcing Victor's resignation had arrived just an hour earlier. Reading it should have brought him some sense of closure, some sense of victory. But as Daniel leaned back in his chair, he felt nothing but emptiness. He glanced toward the far end of the floor, where Victor's assistant sat behind a desk piled with papers, her face drawn and pale. The door to the executive suite remained shut, its glass walls a stark reminder of the power Victor had once wielded. Now, that power was gone. By lunchtime, the office gossip had reached a fever pitch. People spoke openly about Victor's downfall, speculating about the future of the company and the scandal that had brought him down. Daniel kept his head low, avoiding the curious glances and hushed conversations that seemed to follow him everywhere. He stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, needing space to breathe. The streets of the city were bustling as always, but Daniel barely noticed the movement around him. He found a quiet bench in a nearby park and sank onto it, his elbows resting on his knees. He had done what he set out to do. He had confronted Victor, exposed the truth, and forced him to face the consequences of his actions. The man who had abandoned him and destroyed his mother's career was no longer at the helm of Campbell Enterprises. Justice, in a sense, had been served. So why didn't it feel like a victory? As Daniel sat in the park, his mind drifted back to his mother, Naomi, and the sacrifices she had made over the years. He thought of the nights she had stayed up late, working multiple jobs to provide for him, and the quiet moments of exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. She had carried the weight of Victor's betrayal for decades, and now that burden had shifted in part to him. Pulling out his phone, Daniel typed a quick message to his mother. "It's done. He's out." Her reply came almost immediately. "I saw the news. Are you okay?" Daniel hesitated, staring at the words on the screen. Was he okay? The question lingered in his mind. Finally, he typed back, "I don't know." Back at the office, the fallout from Victor's resignation was already taking shape. The board had appointed an interim CEO, and damage control meetings were happening on every floor. The company's PR team was working overtime to salvage its reputation, while employees speculated about how the scandal might affect their jobs. Daniel returned to his desk, his movements mechanical. He tried to focus on the report in front of him, but the words blurred together, meaningless against the backdrop of everything that had happened. The anger that had driven him for so long had burned out, leaving behind a hollow ache he couldn't quite shake. He glanced around the office, noticing how many people were still looking toward Victor's now vacant office. The man who had loomed so large in their world was gone, and yet his shadow remained. It would take time for the company to recover, if it ever truly did. That evening, Daniel found himself back in the small apartment he shared with Naomi. She was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, the scent of herbs and spices filling the air. Daniel dropped his briefcase by the door and sank into a chair at the table. Naomi turned, her eyes soft with concern. "Rough day?" she asked. Daniel nodded, running a hand through his hair. "It's over. He's out. But it doesn't feel like it's over." Naomi placed a bowl of soup in front of him and sat down across the table. "Justice isn't always clean," she said quietly. "Sometimes it leaves scars." Daniel stared into the bowl, the steam rising in delicate tendrils. "I thought it would feel better. I thought I'd feel relieved, or proud, or something. But all I feel is tired." Naomi reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "That's because justice isn't about making you feel better. It's about doing what's right, even when it hurts." Daniel looked up at her, his chest tightening. "I just keep thinking about all the years we lost, all the things he did to you. And now he's gone. But it doesn't change any of that." "No, it doesn't," Naomi said softly. "But it means he can't hurt us anymore. And that's enough." Daniel nodded, though the ache in his chest remained. He had spent so long focused on bringing Victor down that he hadn't considered what would come next. Now, he was left with a blank slate, a chance to decide what kind of life he wanted to build, free from Victor's shadow. For the first time that day, Daniel allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Maybe it's enough," he said quietly. Naomi squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride and love. "It is, Daniel. And so are you." The rest of the evening passed in quiet conversation and simple comforts. The scars left by Victor's betrayal would take time to heal, but for the first time Daniel felt like he could start moving forward. The fight was over. Now it was time to rebuild. The familiar warmth of Naomi and Hayes' cozy apartment enveloped Daniel as he walked in. The faint aroma of lavender and the soft glow of the evening lamp made the space feel like a sanctuary, a place where the weight of the outside world could finally be set down. Naomi was seated at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. She looked up as Daniel entered, her face lighting up with a mixture of relief and concern. "You're home," she said softly, motioning to the empty chair across from her. Daniel dropped his bag by the door and joined her at the table. For a moment he simply sat there, his hands resting on the wood, his gaze distant. The events of the past few weeks had taken their toll, on both of them. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, his voice quiet but resolute. "I can't stay at Campbell Enterprises." Naomi tilted her head, studying him. "You're sure?" Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "Every day I walk in there, I feel like I'm living in his shadow. I wanted to succeed there because I thought it would mean something, like I was proving myself. But now I realize I don't need his company or his name to do that." Naomi reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I'm proud of you, Daniel. It takes courage to walk away from something like that." "It feels more like running away," Daniel admitted, his voice tinged with guilt. Naomi shook her head firmly. "It's not running away if you're choosing to forge your own path. You're not leaving out of fear. You're leaving because you deserve better." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Daniel finally looked up, his eyes meeting Naomi's. "How did you do it, Mom? After everything he did to you, how did you keep going?" Naomi's expression softened, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. "Because I had you," she said simply. "When everything else felt hopeless, I looked at you and saw my reason to fight. Victor tried to take everything from me, but he couldn't take you, and that was enough." Daniel's chest tightened, emotions swirling inside him. "You shouldn't have had to do it alone." "But I wasn't alone," Naomi said, squeezing his hand. "We did it together, Daniel. We survived. And survival, that's its own kind of justice." Naomi's words hung in the air, their quiet strength settling over him. For so long, he had equated justice with retribution, with making Victor pay for what he'd done. But sitting here with his mother, Daniel realized that their survival, the life they had built together, was the ultimate victory. "I'm going to find something else," Daniel said, his voice steadier now. "Something that's mine. I don't know what it looks like yet, but I know it won't be tied to him." Naomi smiled, her eyes glistening. "You've already found your path, Daniel. It's been inside you all along. You're free now, free to build the life you want." As the night wore on, they talked and laughed, the weight of their shared past no longer looming over them, but serving as a foundation for their future. For the first time in weeks, the air between them felt light, filled with hope. The morning sunlight streamed through the apartment windows, casting soft golden patterns across the floor. The apartment was alive with the sounds of a new day, the faint chirping of birds outside, the whistle of a kettle on the stove, and the comforting rustle of papers as Daniel F. Hayes flipped it through his notebook at the kitchen table. Naomi poured steaming tea into 2 mugs and joined him, setting one down in front of him. She glanced at the open notebook, filled with scribbled ideas and potential plans. "What's on your mind this morning?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. Daniel smiled faintly, tapping his pen against the table. "I've been thinking about what's next," he said. "I want to do something meaningful, something that's mine. I've spent so much time trying to prove myself to people who don't even matter. I don't want to waste another second doing that." Naomi nodded, her gaze steady. "What does meaningful look like to you?" "I don't know yet," Daniel admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But I keep coming back to this idea of helping others, maybe consulting, or working with startups. People like us, people who've been overlooked, who just need someone to believe in them." Naomi's face broke into a proud smile. "That sounds perfect for you. You've always had a way of seeing potential in others, even when they couldn't see it themselves." Daniel felt a flicker of excitement, his ideas beginning to solidify. "I want to build something that makes a difference. Not just for me, but for others too." They spent the morning brainstorming, bouncing ideas back and forth like they had so many times before. Naomi's unwavering support and encouragement bolstered Daniel's confidence, making the daunting prospect of starting over feel manageable. "You've got a blank slate," Naomi said as she poured them a second cup of tea. "And the best part? You get to decide what to put on it." Daniel nodded, his chest swelling with determination. "For the first time, I feel like I'm in control, like I'm not tied to him or his choices anymore." "That's because you're not," Naomi said. "Victor's legacy doesn't define you, Daniel. You've proven that. Now it's time to create your own." The day passed in a quiet rhythm of planning and reflection. Daniel jotted down ideas, researched opportunities, and allowed himself to dream without limits. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. As the evening settled in, Daniel and Naomi found themselves on the couch, a blanket draped over their legs as they shared a bowl of popcorn. The television played softly in the background, but their attention was on each other. "Thank you, Mom," Daniel said suddenly, his voice filled with emotion. Naomi turned to him, her expression gentle. "For what?" "For everything," Daniel said. "For always being there, for never giving up, even when things were impossible." Naomi reached over and squeezed his hand. "You've always been my reason, Daniel. And seeing you find your way now, that's all the thanks I need." As the night deepened, Daniel and Naomi sat together in the quiet comfort of their home, the trials of their past finally behind them. Their journey had been long and painful, but it had also been a testament to the strength of love, resilience, and the power of choosing one's own path. Daniel glanced at his mother, her eyes reflecting the light of the lamp, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "If there's one thing I've learned," he said softly, "it's that our past doesn't define us. It might shape us, but it doesn't get to decide who we become." Naomi smiled, her hand resting over his. "And the most important thing is to keep moving forward, to build a life filled with purpose and kindness. That's the best way to leave the past where it belongs." They sat there in silence, letting the moment sink in. They were no longer bound by shadows. They were free and empowered to create a future on their own terms. In life, we can't always control what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond. Daniel and Naomi's story is a reminder that resilience, love, and determination can overcome even the darkest of circumstances. The past may leave scars, but it's how we rise from those moments that define us. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more heartfelt and inspiring tales. Together, we can find hope, strength, and a reminder of what it means to move forward truly.